And welcome back. Israel is an illegal occupier. The Jewish people fled Europe after the Holocaust and stole land that Palestinian Arabs had inhabited for thousands of years. Does this sound familiar? On many college campuses and newsrooms, this is the only narrative on the Middle East. It's a false and shameful narrative. As David Brogg shows in his great new book, Reclaiming Israel's History, Roots, Rights, and the Struggle for Peace. David is Kufai's founding executive director and an active member of our board of directors. And he sat down with us to discuss his new book and setting the record straight on Israel. Take a look. Well, David, thanks so much for joining us here on The Watchman. Welcome back, my friend.
Eric, always great to be with you.
Yeah, and what a time to have you. You know, you have this great new book out, Reclaiming Israel's History. We have UN resolutions coming down, denying the Jewish claim to Jerusalem, saying that Israel is the problem, there's no peace in the Middle East because of Israel. David, talk about that false narrative today and how this is nothing new, unfortunately. You outline in your book. Talk about this false narrative that's been established and why it's so wrong.
The history of Israel's struggle for survival, the history of Israel's struggle for peace is something you know and I know, but most people in this country don't. And unfortunately, most people in government don't. The UN clearly doesn't. And so it's important to remind people of this history and to remind them of which side of this conflict has repeatedly sought peace, sacrificed for peace, and that's Israel. Ever since the modern Zionist movement began in the late 1800s.
You know, we were talking before the interview, David, that we know this here in the pro-Israel community at Christians United for Israel. We know this very well. But the average American may not know these facts that you're giving us. That's why the book is so important, Reclaiming Israel's History, and so timely. And one of the points I think we need to talk about, and you referenced it in your last answer, is the Jewish presence in the land of Israel. We know the temple was destroyed AD 70 by Titus, and after the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Jewish people were dispersed to the ends of the earth. But David, there was always a Jewish presence in the land. The Jews never really left Israel, did they?
The fact is the Jews never left their land. After the 70 AD, Romans they destroyed villages by the hundreds, Jewish villages. They exiled a big percentage of the Jewish people. But the Jews clung to their land. You know, the Jews were still a majority in the land of Israel until well into the 5th century.
Wow.
In the 10th century, 1,000 years after the supposed exile, Jews and Christians together still comprised a majority of the people in the land of Israel, despite the fact that it had been ruled by Muslims for a few centuries. The Jewish return in the late 1800s under the modern Zionist movement was just the latest in a series of Jewish returns.
Yeah.
Time after time, when Jews would go back to Jerusalem or Tzfat or Tiberias and write back to their families and their friends, it's okay, we can live here, we can survive here, they flocked in. They rebuilt their cities. In the mid-1500s, they rebuilt the city of Tzfat, Safed, in northern Israel. At the time, they were able to develop a textile industry in Tzfat. And 3,000 looms were operating in Tzfat. They started making uniforms for the Ottoman army. They started importing wool and importing silk and exporting textiles to the entire Middle East. Jews started flocking back. They made Tzfat a center of Jewish learning and Kabbalah and mystical Jewish writing. Until, again, the tyrants that ruled the land of Israel, the Muslim tyrants at the time, destroyed Tzfat. Their Arab and Bedouin neighbors came in and stole everything they owned and destroyed the city.
I can't overstate how important these facts are for our viewers. The average person out there does not know that the Jewish people were the majority in Jerusalem in the mid-1800s, in the 1850s. That's amazing information.
And it's under the worst of conditions. You know, Christian pilgrims and British diplomats would go to Jerusalem and they would write back home how much the Jews of Jerusalem are suffering. Because under Islamic rule, Jews are not allowed and Christians are not allowed to repair their churches or synagogues. They're not allowed to build new churches or synagogues. And at the time, Jews were not allowed to repair their synagogues. So people would come visit and say, this is terrible. The conditions under which Jews...
Mark Twain wrote about it.
Mark Twain wrote about it.
The famous American author,
That's right. He visited the Middle East at this time, at this juncture in history, and he wrote two things. One, he wrote how much Jews suffered under Muslim rule. And two, he wrote how very few people he saw throughout his travels in the land.
That's right.
The fact is, Jews at this point, British diplomats would write, when they would see the British diplomats approaching and would think that they were Muslims, they would get off of Jews were not allowed to ride horses. That was too noble an animal for Jews.
Yeah.
They would get off their donkeys and walk, because that's how degraded they were. That's how persecuted they were.
In Jerusalem.
They were not allowed to ride even on a lesser animal, a donkey, in Jerusalem if a Muslim passed. Even under these conditions of persecution and degradation, they became the majority in the city in the mid-1800s. Wow. That shows the connection of the Jews to this land. Yeah. That shows how desperately they wanted to live there and how desperately they wanted to return. The minute conditions allowed, the population soared.
Folks, the book is called Reclaiming Israel's History, and you can find it on Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, and wherever books are sold from coast to coast. Pick it up. More with David after the break. Stick around.